Rhino Karura. It borders Egypt and Israel via the Sinai. It's funny how some people believe in their heart of hearts that the populations that occupy specific areas in the world have occupied those areas forever. Rhinocarura, according to Greek and Roman writings, was started by an Ethiopian who took over that region. And then he took over parts of Gaza. This Ethiopian, when people misbehaved, would leave people in the Sinai with their nose cut off, which is why Rhinocaruro is called what it was called, the place where people have their noses cut off. This is only one of the places in history where the Ethiopians had taken over. According to the Greeks, the Romans, the ancient Egyptians, and all these other people, the Nubians would flank Egypt. The Nubians, not the Egyptians, the Nubians would flank Egypt. So the Nubians would be in that area that's in Asia called the Sinai, and they'd also be in places like Akhmim, going down the areas like Abu, and they would have full contact with people from Ethiopia and Eritrea and those places, and they frequented people who were foreigners. We can even read it right now in Diodorus Siculus or Strabo or any of these people. Before we read this verse, the context is that he's naming kings and which areas they own, going one by one. So you can see before we go into Reina Korura, he says battle was fought between Ptolemies the Fourth and Antiochus the Great. Then Rhinocolura, so called from the people with the mutilated noses that had been settled there in early times, for some Ethiopian invaded Egypt and instead of killing the wrongdoers, cut off their noses and settled them at that place, assuming that on the account of their disgraceful faces, they would no longer dare do people wrong. Now the whole of this country from Gaza is barren and sandy, but still more so is the country that lies next above it, which contains Lake Serbonus, a lake which lies approximately parallel to the sea and in interval leaves a short passage as far as Iragma, as it is called. The lake is about 200 stadia in the length, and its maximum breadth is about 60 stadia. But the Iragma has become filled up with earth. Then follows another continuous tract of this kind as far as Cases, and then comes the Pelicium. Cases is sandy hill without water and forms of promontory. The body of Pompey the Great is buried there, and on the temple of Zeus Casus. Near this place Pompey the Great was slain, being treacherously murdered by the Egyptians. Then comes the road to Pelusium, on which lie Gera and the Palisade of Chabrias, as it is called, and the pits near Pelusium. These pits are formed by side flows from the Nile, the region being by nature. As for Judai, its western extremities towards Caches are occupied by the Idumeans, and by the lake. The Idumeans are Nabateans, but owing to a sedition, they were banished from there, joined the Judeans, and shared in the same customs with them. The greater part of the region near the sea is occupied by Lake Serbonus and by the country continuous with the lake as far as Jerusalem, for this city is also near the sea. For, as I have already said, it is visible from the seaport of Iope. This region lies towards the north, and it is inhabited in general, as is each place in particular, by mixed stocks of people from Egyptian and Arabian and Phoenician tribes, for such are those who occupy Galilee and Hyrcanus and Philadelphia and Samaria, which last Herod surnamed Sebaste. But though the inhabitants are mixed up, the most prevalent of the accredited reports in regard to the temple at Jerusalem represents the ancestors of the present Judeans, as they are called, as Egyptians. That's from Strabo's Geography, Book 17. In Diodorus Siculus' Histories, we find him saying this about the exact same king. After this king, a long line of successors on the throne accomplished no deed worth recording, but Amasis, who became king many generations later, ruled the masses of the people with great harshness. Many he punished unjustly, great numbers he deprived of their possessions, and towards all his conduct was without exception contemptuous and arrogant. Now, for a time, his victims bore up under this, being unable in any way to protect themselves against those of greater power. But when Actesinas, the king of the Ethiopians, led an army against Amasis, their hatred seized the opportunity, and most of the Egyptians revolted. As a consequence, since he was easily overcome, Egypt fell under the rule of the Ethiopians. But Actesinas carried his good fortune as a man should and conducted himself in a kindly manner towards his subject. For instance, he had his own manner of dealing with thieves, neither putting to death such as were liable that punishment, nor letting them go with no punishment at all. For after he had gathered towards out of the whole land those who were charged with some crime, and had held a thoroughly fair examination of their cases, he took all who had been judged guilty, and cutting off their noses, settled them in a colony on the edge of the desert, founding the city, which was called Rhinocolura, after the lot of its inhabitants. This city, which lies on the border between Egypt and Syria, not far from the sea coast, is wanting in particularly everything which is necessary for man's existence, for it is surrounded by land which is full of brine, while within the walls there is but a small supply of water from wells. The delta is in the north of Egypt, and it's a triangle forming the delta sign in Greco-Roman writing. And this delta was known to be frequented by Ethiopians. Ethiopians just lived there amongst the islands of the delta. And we can see here where Diodorus Siculus continues from where he left off, and he says, every kind of precious stone, speaking generally, the river forms so many islands that the report of them can scarcely be credited, for apart from the region surrounded by water in what is called the delta, there are more than 700 other islands, of which some are irrigated by the Ethiopians and planted with millet, though others are so overrun by snakes and dog-faced baboons and other animals of every kind that human beings cannot set foot upon them. So we see here he's clearly stating that the Deltamen are Ethiopians. and I hate to be the guy who repeats things a lot, but I gotta do it. Remember, I told you that a deltaman in the Tale of Sanahui, there's this comparison they make that a delta man versus an Abu man. But as you can see here, and I stated this before, a delta man is an Ethiopian in the same way that an Abu man is a Nubian. These are the same people. All they're talking about, the difference is that they are distant but belonging to the same country, Egypt. Now, I know a lot of people are going to be upset because they don't like seeing evidence, but think about it. Why would these guys lie about this information? What do they hold to gain by pretending that there were Ethiopians in Israel? What do they gain by pretending that there were Ethiopians in the delta near the Sinai region and Ethiopians in the Sinai region, Ethiopians in the southern borders of Egypt, Ethiopians within the borders of Egypt, Ethiopians in Abu, Ethiopians in the capital? What do they gain by pretending this? The only conspiracy theory here are the people who believe that these Greeks made this all up when they're talking about a time that both is in their history and in their present. So people can check why would they lie about that? It's quite obvious, and it has been for a while, that the ancient Egyptians are Ethiopians. And more than that, they had some people come in and join them, but for the most part, they are dotted as Ethiopians. And even people outside of Ethiopia, right? For instance, Israel and Gaza, those places are pointed out. The guy said there, the people of Judea are mixed between Egyptians or Egyptian peoples. He didn't say Egyptians, he said Egyptian peoples, meaning more than one. It's a plural, more than one type, because obviously by their time, Egyptians weren't specifically one race, but Egyptian peoples and Arabians. That's what they say. And of course, some people, again, like I said in the beginning, they don't know that Jews didn't occupy the entire region. There were different tribes that existed. It wasn't just Jews, there's Palestinians, there's Gazans, there's Arabs, there's all kinds of groups that existed there. Numidians that existed in those regions, Ammonians.